Welcome to the Enneagram 2.0 podcast. I'm Beatrice Chestnut.
And I'm Uranio Paes.
And today we are talking about defense mechanisms. This is an important topic. Defense mechanisms are really, in some ways, the glue that holds in place the Enneagram types patterns. So I think it's really important that we discuss what they are and how they operate and how the different types use these defense mechanisms in the ways that they do.
And here we are again talking about something highly unconscious for all of us, and yet highly important, because unless we learn somehow how to turn off our defense mechanisms, we won't experience major growth. The defense mechanisms play a role of keeping us rooted in our passion and fixation, which are, as we said in other podcast episodes, which are the main basis of personality and limited level of awareness within our type.
The defense mechanisms are important to understand for many reasons. But it's also important to understand that even though we call these defense mechanisms and that they are about defending ourselves in a certain way, they can also be very adaptive and healthy early on in life. We need to defend ourselves in the face of psychic pain and difficult experiences that we aren't ready to tolerate when we're younger. However, the problem with these defense mechanisms is they become habitual. They really get set in place in deeply rooted ways. And as you said, they become very unconscious. And so they really hold in place some of the patterns that are defensive in the sense that they originated to protect us from two things, really. From experiencing pain that would either have been unbearable or that we fear will be unbearable. And then the second thing is they help us to maintain self-esteem or to protect the ego self-image. They help us guard against incorporating ideas or taking in feelings that would threaten the ego. So to some extent, they're healthy in that they help us not experience pain that would be hard to experience. But of course, in a certain point in our life, they keep us from growing because we are capable of feeling that pain when we grow older, when we become adults. But sometimes we retain the child's fear or the child's belief or sense that pain will be too much. Either the pain of experiencing something that we went through early on that was really, really actually very painful that we couldn't have tolerated, or some sort of threat to our ego, some sort of message about ourselves that maybe we need to take in, that we need to understand. So what's important to understand about these defense mechanisms is they operate very unconsciously, and they operate to hold the patterns of our personality in place, these habitual patterns that really make up the substance of our personality. And they operate on one level to keep us from feeling the pain that we experienced early on in life that we couldn't allow ourselves to experience. It would have been too much for our young psyches. But also to protect us from becoming more aware of things that might threaten our ego self-image. And so I think we need to recognize as adults, when we start working on ourselves, when we start seeking to use the insights of our personality type to grow, that the more we become aware of these specific defense mechanisms, which is really sort of the ways that our personality patterns stay fixed and rigid. The more we understand that, the more we can break free of some of our patterns, the more we can see these defense mechanisms in action. the more that we can grow beyond the rigid patterns that make up our personality.
Yes, exactly, B. I have a few things to say in sync with what you've just shared. First, there's this book that I like from Joseph Burgo called Why Do I Do That? Psychological Defense Mechanisms and the Hidden Ways They Shape Our Lives. And he defines psychological defense mechanisms um, as invisible methods by which we exclude unacceptable thoughts and feelings from awareness. Also, he says, in the process, they subtly distort our perceptions of reality in both our personal relationships and the emotional terrain within us. And then later on, he says, the problem inherent in psychological defenses is that while they're necessary and useful for each and every one of us in coping with the inevitable pain that goes with being human, when they become too deeply entrenched, they may prevent us from accessing important emotions we need to face. So I think that speaks a little bit to what you were sharing. And the picture that comes to my mind is a little bit like this: the passion is a fortress, the fixation is a castle, perhaps, in personality territory. And what is the defense mechanism? It's a little bit like the guardians outside those places to avoid invaders to go inside the fortress and the castle. And then the defense mechanism is also, those big doors that cannot be trespassed, and also, some of the cannons positioned strategically to kill whoever or whatever is trying to invade. So it's all of that. It's all the defense system with different resources, ready to protect the fortress of personality. And you said in the beginning something I really like, that defense mechanism is sort of the glue of personality. I remember hearing this first time being said by Helen Palmer. I don't know, maybe you do, if this was created by her, but I think it's brilliant to say it's the glue. And it's very important to understand this because when we talk about our psyche, we need to understand that the fixation, the passion, the subtypes, the instincts are what we call the personality structure. But the defense mechanism is not really part of the structure. It's more the glue that keeps all of these parts of the structure in place, right? So beyond the importance of the defense mechanism protecting us, and the importance of us negotiating some space with them to feel emotions, as I read from this book, there is another reason why it's really important to work on the defense mechanisms that is more spiritual. We cannot get back in touch with essence or the higher self or the higher centers of intelligence, with the virtue, the holy ideas described by the Enneagram, unless we learn how to dissolve a little bit that glue, to put down the weapons, the cannons, to open that big door of the castle and the fortress, and so on, and negotiate some peace with some invaders into that territory.
Yes, and all of what you're saying really highlights the fact of this word defense. It's a military metaphor. And I think it dates back to Freud in terms of understanding it in terms of a military metaphor. But I do think it works, that it does protect us. These defense mechanisms are ways that we unconsciously protect ourselves from anxiety, from difficult feelings or emotional experiences. And as I said, threats to the way we want or need to see ourselves being in the world. All of us need to, in some ways, walk around with a positive sense of ourselves so that we can get up in the morning or walk around and feel okay at a basic level. And that's important to recognize. And it's important to recognize that although this is a military metaphor, that it sounds like a bad thing sometimes. Like if we tell someone you're being too defensive, and it can be a bad thing. It can also be an important thing. It can also be a healthy adaptive strategy, especially earlier on in life, for uh, moving forward in our lives and keeping ourselves together and developing a healthy sense of self. It's only in adulthood when we really want to grow beyond a certain point that we need to recognize that these unconscious mechanisms may be holding us back to the extent that we don't see them, we aren't conscious of them, we aren't recognizing these really automatic, uh, sort of psychological ways that we don't move beyond, that we keep ourselves from being more conscious and aware of what we're doing over and over again, and how we may be resisting developing a wider range of strategies for operating in the world that we would be able to cultivate if we could be more aware of how we stay stuck in old patterns of protecting ourselves, defending ourselves, usually against some sort of painful experience.
Yeah, what you've just said is really important in my view, and we need to be very careful when we do work on the defense mechanisms, and it shouldn't be a premature piece of work. It's very delicate. And what we suggest to you, our podcast listener, is that you just start observing those ways that you cope with reality, and how exactly these defense mechanisms operate. And a tip, if I may, is that they are almost ever present, and they find their ways, very subtle ways at times, to manifest themselves. And everything that gets ever present becomes harder for us to see. We get caught in all that. And we think that living life is doing that thing. And also, we sometimes wrongly assume that other people are do the same while they don't.
And I think something else that's interesting about talking about the psychological defense mechanisms is this is a way that the Enneagram types really line up very clearly with Western psychology. So, if anybody out there ever gets questioned when they're interested in the Enneagram by people saying, well, is there anything valid about this? Like, why is this a real thing? Where does this come from? One of the things I think is really clear and really validating about the Enneagram is that it does line up so completely with Western psychology. For instance, there's a book called Psychological Diagnosis that I really like. It's one of my favorite books about psychological types and defenses, precisely because it's written very clearly. I think some educated lay people may be able to understand it. The subtitle is Understanding Personality Structure in the Clinical Process. I think therapists especially will appreciate this book, but it really clearly lays out some of the psychological defense mechanisms. And then it really clearly talks about how some personality type structures are in many ways defined by the specific defenses that they use. The book is called again Psychoanalytic Diagnosis. It's by Nancy McWilliams, And I really, really appreciate this book because, and if you know the Enneagram, as you read it, you'll really see the Enneagram types that line up right really, really well with these psychoanalytic types, these psychological types. And I'm pretty sure Nancy McWilliams doesn't know the Enneagram, but when you see the way that these correspondences are, and we'll talk about each type in terms of the specific defense mechanisms they use the most. I think it's another way of understanding that these Enneagram types are very much correlated with psychological theory and a lot of the ways that psychotherapists think about personality and work with it, even when they don't know the Enneagram at all. So now we'll talk about the 9 types in terms of the defense mechanisms that they use the most. But a couple things I want to say about the types in general and the defense mechanisms in general. One thing is, as we talk about these, remember that you don't need to be like working really hard to undo these defense mechanisms. The main thing that I think we would suggest is that you just start seeing them when you see them in action. Just start recognizing, naming them, saying, oh, there I'm doing that. That you observe these things non-judgmentally without feeling like you need to do anything differently. I think, again, sometimes when we realize we're being defensive, we automatically think that's a bad thing and we need to stop doing it. And yes, in the big picture, it is important to get to the point where you are less defensive, where you're more aware of yourself being defensive or in defensive mode, and having these defense mechanisms rule your behavior. But as a first step, I think the main thing to do is to just start noticing these things and calling them what they are, and not feeling like you need to go against them in a big way, because just making what we're talking about today conscious is going to be a lot. If you can just start saying, oh, I'm projecting. Oh, there I am. I'm a 4 and I'm introjecting something. Or, oh, I'm a 5 and I'm using the defense mechanism of isolation or withdrawal. That's going to be really important right there. And the second thing I want to say is that while we're going to be talking about each of the 9 types in terms of the 1 or 2 or 3 main defense mechanisms they tend to employ the most, I really want to highlight the fact that all of us use these defense mechanisms, right? Like, I'm a 2 and my main defense mechanism is repression. However, I see myself rationalizing all the time, which is the main type 7 defense mechanism, right? So it doesn't mean I'm a 7 or that I have a 7 as a secondary type. It just means I'm human, and that sometimes I rationalize, sometimes I project. We all do all of these. So I really want to ask you to remember that as you hear these things. And you may want to notice what defense mechanisms you see yourself using the most, other than the ones associated with your type. But it'll be important to notice the operation of the main ones that you tend to use according to your type. So let's start, as we usually do, with type 8. Let's talk about the defense mechanisms of type 8. And I'll start. I'll say that probably the most important defense mechanism to understand if you're an 8 is denial. And again, we can all engage in denial, but this is really the big one for 8s. 8s tend to deny things. And what denial is a way of, simply like it sounds, denying the reality of something, having a sense that something doesn't exist. And we often see this in 8s when they deny their vulnerability or their weakness. It's as if it just isn't there. There is no weakness in the picture. It's as if saying, because I believe it doesn't exist, it doesn't exist.
Yes, exactly. And denial shows up for eights in so many different ways. So I was, before this recording, I was listening to a podcast from my country, Brazil. And someone was interviewing a famous person who I know to be an eight, and then the interviewer asked the question, "So, have you always been bossy?" And the interviewee said, "No, I'm not bossy. I like to think I am an organizer. I organize things." So that was denial right there. And many times, if you are talking to an eight, the very first reaction the eight has is saying the word no. So by saying no, you can see a little bit the defense mechanism in operation, right? Even if right next the type 8 person sort of agrees with you, and there is denial even in in a tendency not to really tell you that they understood that you are right, but just doing what you said should be done instead, not acknowledging things. There's some denial behind that, and denial of pain, denial of tiredness. Didn't like Just to give another example, I've seen several times aides who were doing a sport or exercising, and then they got really hurt, but they didn't feel it at the moment. And what is that makes them not to feel the pain at the moment? It's denial. And they can deny reality because they have this wishful thinking and the sensation that they can do anything. They make the impossible happen. So all of that is behind denial and much more.
Yes, denial is a little bit like, if I don't acknowledge it, it's not happening. And as we've seen with eight, sometimes they can believe that their view of reality equals the objective, the only reality. And it can be their way of denying uh, the presence of something that they don't want to acknowledge. Now, I think it's also important to name that in some ways, denial can be healthy and adaptive, especially really early in life. And certainly we can also see that, let's say you need to go have a conflict with someone and you need to be strong in a battle. It helps to deny your weakness, right? Because it's going to make you maybe even more effective. However, when eight seek to grow, they really need to get in touch with the fact that they have denied certain things and just push them out of their sense of reality. Now, a second defense mechanism that I see eights using sometimes is called omnipotent control. And it's the idea that I can do anything I want, that I'm in control. It's a kind of, it's a little bit what we sometimes call magical thinking of or a kind of grandiosity that I can do whatever I think I can do, and I can believe I'm in control, and so I am in control of everything.
Yes, and just to add two more examples of denial that I believe to be central. Denial is really big when it comes to vulnerability. So eights deny any feelings of weaknesses or fear, or although not all eights would say that they deny fear, but some sorts of fear at least they deny. They may deny sadness and feeling a little bit of lack of self-confidence. And the other form of denial that happens a lot is when looking back to childhood, they say it was all fine. I didn't suffer with this or that. It was fine. And then when you listen to the stories, it's obviously not something that could have been fine.
Exactly, exactly. Good examples, good description. So, shall we move on to nine?
Yes.
So, the main defense mechanism for type 9 is dissociation. And just as there's a way that in the Enneagram system, type 9 is a kind of foundational type for all the types. For instance, nines are the prototype of the ways we all fall asleep to ourselves or to our own experience. All of us do that, but that's the main thing the nine does. And nines' sense of their defense mechanism of dissociation is a kind of just withdrawing consciousness from something that feels threatening. It's a kind uh, of not being connected to in an aware way of something that is happening that might be uh, stressful or traumatic or painful. It's like a unconscious complete withdrawal of consciousness from an experience. And dissociation in some ways is kind of the root experience within all the defenses. There's a kind of dissociation is sort of a foundational aspect of these defense mechanisms that we're talking about generally. It is this kind of way of removing consciousness from what's happening.
Yeah, this is very good, B. And when we call the defense mechanism narcotization, it's similar to what you're describing. Although there might be some differences that perhaps you can explain us. But narcotization doesn't have to do with substances. It's narcotizing yourself with any kind of thing that is done repeatedly. So it can be narcotizing your pain, your anger by doing a lot of sports or watching a lot of TV, being all the time on Facebook, or maybe reading a lot or going to too many courses, or doing puzzles, jigsaws, or collecting stuff, or even listening to people talk all the time instead of talking about yourself, or narcotizing yourself with food, or with anything that would bring us to a more literal meaning of narcotization, like in substances like food even, or drinks, or whatever. And or it could be narcotizing yourself by just allowing you to spend hours and hours sitting down on that very comfortable couch, instead of going to do the thing that you need to do. So there are multiple ways of how nines narcotize, but they are all meant to avoid being in touch with anger and doing the important thing they need to do, whatever that is.
And I think it's important to say that dissociation and to some degree narcotization, these can be very normal, adaptive ways, especially of coping with trauma. When we're young and we go through a trauma, we need to dissociate because we couldn't stay sane and together psychologically if we really felt all the pain or the impact of what's happening. So I think we need to really emphasize that early on, dissociation is it's adaptive. It's a way of surviving and making it through very difficult or painful experiences. But of course, later on, when we want to heal trauma, when we want to grow beyond a kind of rigidity to our personality and our the defensive way that the personality operates, because the personality is to some degree, to a large degree, a defensive self structure. We need to face our trauma. And this is why we need to heal old traumas, past hurts, why we suggest that people go to therapy, especially if they've had a difficult background, because we need to at some point stop dissociating. We need to get more in touch with the reality of our experience when we have the support and the resources that are required to be able to do that. And this is why we often really recommend people get support. from friends, partners, family, therapists, professionals, healing professionals, in order to do this. So dissociation can be normal, but if you're an adult 9 and you notice that you can tend to just blank out or do all the things that you just mentioned to kind of go to sleep to what's really happening in the moment, to what you're really feeling, then that can be a sense that dissociation is happening, that you're just kind of going to sleep, or your consciousness is going away from or withdrawing from the truth of your experience. And it's really important to recognize when that happens. And again, sometimes even when we as adults revisit old traumas, or if something reminds us of an old trauma, we'll dissociate in the moment. Like sometimes you can be talking about something and all of a sudden forget what you're talking about.
Exactly. Yeah.
Sometimes that's a kind of dissociation. And again, as an adult, when you're working on yourself, when you're seeking to grow, that's a great signal. I need to look more into that. I need to understand what's happening there. I need to get more conscious of this defensive mechanism so that I can remove the need for it, really, by consciously moving toward whatever I'm needing to avoid at an unconscious level.
Yeah, we've seen many times the nines that have huge experiences doing retreats, workshops, and then, much to other people's surprise, they they forget that piece of healing and that thing that they remembered not too much later. And that is narcotization coming back again and again and again. But it's not narcotization that does that. It's all defense mechanisms. It's not because we have worked on it one time that they won't operate next time.
Exactly, exactly. So let's talk about type 1. The main defense mechanism for type 1 is reaction formation. Now, reaction formation is a very interesting defense. Um, it happens when we as humans turn something that we're feeling into its opposite in order to render it less threatening. So we may have a feeling, an emotion inside that feels somehow threatening to us to feel. So for ones, for instance, this can often be anger. They naturally feel anger for different reasons. But because it can feel threatening to feel it and to express it, it threatens their sense of wanting to be good or virtuous or follow the rules or do the right thing. They can sometimes believe they'll create damage or impact people negatively if they express their anger. So sometimes what happens with ones, for instance, is they'll experience anger, but then instead of feeling it and expressing it, they will unconsciously go to, tune out that anger and express the opposite. So they'll get, like, for instance, much more polite and friendly. And they'll focus on being very courteous or very appropriate according to whatever they believe that means. And usually it means maybe being very correct, or being really nice or benevolent. These can all be ways that ones are experiencing the defense mechanism of reaction formation, transforming hatred into love or frustration into friendliness. All of these things can be ways that ones, interestingly, um, don't experience the main emotion they're feeling and go all the way to the other end of the spectrum and actually express the very opposite of what they're experiencing inside.
Yeah, so since Freud, psychology has explained how humans are prone to having pleasure experiences. And there is something called the impulse for pleasure. And that impulse happens if you're a human being and if you're alive. So everybody has it. So pleasure comes as an experience that somatically you want to breathe in and down, but really down to the very bottom of the breath channel, beyond the abdominal cavity, to a place that spiritual traditions call the hara or the dantian. And getting there, you have all the pleasure with whatever you're thinking that the object of pleasure may be. Now, what happens with ones is that all the time when that impulse for pleasure is going down there to that place, there is a formation of a reaction against it. It's a force at least as big as the pleasure impulse, going the other direction, pushing it away. And what that does is create tension, body, muscle tension, and dissatisfaction of not fulfilling the pleasure impulse as human beings instinctively feel that they need to do. So, one of the dramas behind um, reaction formation is that it happens after the person has felt the pleasure impulse. This makes it different from the defense mechanism we'll explain next when talking about type 2, which is repression. So, in repression, it doesn't surface, but in reaction formation, it does surface. So, I feel that impulse and then boom, I go against it. So, in a way, it makes it even harder because you go against some natural movement of your body and your psyche, and you need to use a lot of force and energy to go against that. And this is perhaps one of the reasons why ones become so self-critical. That's because they have this experience of the impulse for pleasure. They don't go there, but they experience it. And some ones say that among everybody, the person who's the wrongest is myself. So I'm the most imperfect because, in a way, they associate the impulse for pleasure with something wrong, which is not ideal because it's not really wrong.
Exactly. And I do think that another big defense mechanism for ones is, as you indicated, repression. And that might be a good segue to our next type, type 2, because repression is the main defense mechanism for type 2. And repression, and again, some of these defense mechanisms are probably going to start to sound similar. And there's a reason for that, because underlying a lot of these defense mechanisms is a kind of dissociation, as we talked about when we talked about type 9. But repression is a kind of motivated forgetting or ignoring. So it's sometimes with repression, there's been a little bit of a consciousness of a feeling or an experience, but then it's as if we forget about it. Sometimes that consciousness can be barely brought into awareness before it's kind of forgotten about. It's relegated to the unconscious. It's a kind of idea that certain emotions or impulses are somehow not okay or threatening. And so it's like a turning away from a consciousness of that experience and an acting as if it doesn't exist, and need to keep it at a distance out of consciousness. For twos, I think sometimes this happens because they may have, again, and we can't say often enough that a lot of, or maybe all of what we're talking about in some cases, happens unconsciously. Often twos will start to experience an emotion, and then there's this unconscious anxiety that that emotion will somehow cause me to be rejected by the other person, because the main defense, the main coping strategy for type twos is creating positive connections with other people. If I can make you like me, if I can please you, if I can support you in some ways to create some sort of positive, mutually supporting relationship, then I can relax a little bit and be okay. And it may be, and I remember as a two myself having the conscious thought, people don't like angry people. If I'm angry, if I'm too opinionated, if I'm expressing frustration or anger in some way that I might naturally feel it, because I do feel it, then that will be cause for me to be rejected by people. and especially people I want to connect with. So I remember having that those thoughts at a conscious level. But then after that, I think there were many occasions where I barely became conscious of feeling angry or irritated or frustrated by something, and then that experience would go away. And I remember specifically when I was in graduate school, probably in my late 20s, and my roommate, who I was spending a lot of time with at the time and talking with a lot about a lot of different things, she noted at one point, she said, I notice you never get angry. And I was actually surprised when she said that, but I thought about it and I realized she was right. And so I think there was a way that over time, because in my childhood, I expressed a lot of anger, mostly at my brother, in a sibling rivalry kind of way. But by the time I was in my late 20s, it's as if I never experienced anger. It's as if it sort of disappeared from my life. It was just never something that I felt or expressed. And I think that's such a good example of how I repressed anger, because I had this sense that even just feeling that and expressing it would torpedo my relationships or my chances of connecting with specific people.
Yeah, thanks for your sharing, B. And it's interesting to me when you say that after the feedback from that friend, you were surprised to see that you didn't access anger. And I think that being surprised when you find out something is typical of repression, because we really keep it outside our radar, underneath the surface, and holding it where we really can't get in touch with. And in a way, we haven't even thought about that. It's funny to me to see sometimes doing panels with choose when we ask a complicated question for them. We ask, so what are your needs, not needs of those other people? And then many times there is just silence. They look in silence, they have no idea, right? So that is a typical reaction when it comes to repression, unless with repression the choose says, well, I don't really have needs. My needs are helping others or doing something for that person or just being liked by them, which is still based on repression of my own individuality, not only my needs, but my own very existence as someone who is enough.
I remember when I discovered my subtype for the first time, with the help of Claudio Naranjo and some of his assistants. They brought to my attention that as a self-preservation two, I was more fearful than the other twos. And I realized at the time that I had really been repressing fear. Because once I recognized that and opened up to it, I really could see how I felt much more anxiety and fear than I had been allowing myself to realize. But one last thing I want to say about repression is that one of the hallmarks of repression is when we are forgetting about or ignoring or pushing out of awareness an emotion, it's because of its power to upset us. Its power to get in the way of something that we think we need. And again, often this is very unconscious, but it's the power to upset. For instance, sometimes people have traumatic experiences like abuse of some kind, and they will completely forget about it until it pops up at some later time. And that forgetting is repression, because that would be really upsetting to be more conscious of that experience, and so it gets repressed. Let's do a short break.
Do you want to dive deeper into the Enneagram? Do you want to take your self development to the next level? Join B and Uranio in their live retreats and register to be a part of their personal mastery program. You can become a Chestnut Paes black belt by taking all 3 of their intensive Enneagram based inner work retreats.
Now let's talk about type 3. The main defense mechanism for type 3 is identification. And this is a really important one because it's really the hallmark of type 3, but sometimes I think it's not understood or not understood as a defense. It may seem odd for identification to even be seen as a defense because most of us see the capacity to identify with as kind of a good thing. It's like, oh, we see some aspect of a person or a role model as something that we want to be like, and so we can see that as a kind of modeling or learning about what we'd like to be, and that informs our sense of who we are or who we become. However, this this capacity to identify when it operates as a defense is a kind of becoming something that we're not. It's as if we need to disconnect from who we are to be something else, to be okay, or to serve the coping strategy of being loved or appreciated or admired by others. And so in threes, this operates very unconsciously and automatically as a way of kind of taking in uh, the image or the aspects or characteristics of the kind of person they think they need to be in order to be valued by others.
Yeah, identification B is a very basic human defense. Like, I remember a good comment made by Peter O'Harahan when explaining identification. And Peter O'Harahan is an Enneagram teacher. He said that human beings, when they don't live with other human beings, in very few, very sad cases in humanity, when they lose touch with human beings after being born and stay with animals, for instance, they don't identify themselves with other humans, and that makes it almost impossible to really become a human after that. So Tarzan is like a myth. It doesn't really exist. And um, what that shows is that there is a very basic part of us that mimics other human beings and adults. And you can even see that in babies, like mimicking something that the father or mother or someone else does, like facial expressions. And identification is really looking for role models out there. And threes do that more than we already do. And it's like everywhere, like identifying with one of the parents and that very big need to be mirrored beyond average. And then also to identify with a teacher at school or with someone who's successful somewhere, and just build your own life script according to what that person does, and not necessarily asking yourself, is that me, or do I really like this, is this my mission? So by identifying, we lose touch with reality, with the reality of who we are. And of course, this is connected to the shape shifting, because when we identify, we shape shift into that other person.
Yes, it's a kind of becoming the other person without realizing that you've done it. But of course, what happens to three is they use this defense mechanism in a way that they don't see because it's unconscious, but then they can have a sense of not knowing who they really are if they've identified with different people and become those things in order to uh, you know, be admired or to be valued or loved, then who are they really? And so this is why it's so important for threes to see the way that identification operates for them. So moving on to type 4, the main defense mechanism for type 4 is introjection. And introjection is an interesting defense mechanism. It's actually the opposite of projection. And projection we'll talk about when we get to type 6. Projection is a kind of a process whereby what's understood as being outside is actually something that comes from inside. So we go unconscious to our own emotion or our own experience, and we imagine it as being outside us somehow. And introjection is the opposite of that. It's the process through which something that is outside is misunderstood as coming from inside us. It's almost like we take in attitudes, opinions, behaviors of significant people around us, uh, and see it as part of us, see it as coming from inside ourselves. And again, this can be problematic because if it's something that really isn't ours, but that we see as coming being part of us. Oftentimes we do that so that we can try to control it, again, unconsciously. However, we've taken in something, we've swallowed something that isn't us, that isn't ours, and sometimes it operates very destructively inside us.
Yeah, good descriptions. So, introjection is what makes force bring other people's qualities inside our hearts. Like envy doesn't work without introjection. Envy being the passion of type 4, and envy being not worse or better than any other passion. Now, it's through introjection that I not only observe things outside and I appreciate what people are or have or what they are living, but I also bring that experience inside my heart by means of introjection. And then I compare and I suffer with the absence of that in my own inner world. So, introjection is the very act of bringing everything back inside. And because forced introject every time, introject things into their own hearts, they have a lot of emotional experiences. Emotionality and sensitivity both are boosted by introjection. It's because I introject that I feel so much. I wouldn't feel as much if I didn't introject.
Yes, introjection can be seen as a kind of identification with the aggressor, if you're familiar with that term. It's a kind of taking inside myself, uh, maybe something that actually hurt me on the outside, partly of being sort of not a helpless victim to it, but I'm going to take control of that thing. So if you've been really criticized, let's say as a 4, it's like you take that criticism inside yourself and now you're doing it to yourself. But there is a unconscious sort of grasping for some sort of power over the experience at the heart of this. But projection and introjection both have in common a sense of confusion or lack of a psychological boundary between self and the outside world. It's a confusion around like this thing that happened actually outside me, I now see or experience as happening inside me. So it's in the same ways 4s can sometimes attack themselves on the inside, sort of think there's something wrong with me, or I'm not good enough, or have a sense of deficiency. Sometimes that comes from having taken that idea in from the outside world, someone or something outside themselves that gave them that feeling or that impression or explicitly that message, but bringing it inside and seeing it as a truth that comes from the internal experience, as opposed to something that is somebody else's or that they could potentially reject if they had a stronger boundary between the inside and the outside world. So let's move on to type 5. And it's interesting because as I've been thinking about the type 5 defense mechanisms, I'm noticing that there are 2 or 3 or 4 that I'm thinking about. And I hope you don't take that personally. It's not that 5s have more defenses or anything like that.
We're
I just
really
think that
problematic.
I just think that there are a few that are coming to mind that all have something to do with type 5. And many of these defense mechanisms will have in common a way of detaching from emotion. So one defense mechanism that fives engage in is called isolation. And sometimes people think isolation is just like a kind of withdrawal or moving away from or being alone or by yourself. But in its technical meaning as a psychological defense mechanism, it's actually a way of dealing with anxieties or other painful states of mind by isolating feeling from knowing. So it's a kind of isolating the emotions from the thinking function. So if there's an emotional experience that's happening that feels threatening, it's as if the five just goes into the thinking function and moves away from unconsciously the emotional part of that experience. Also, withdrawal is another kind of defense mechanism for fives. Maybe I'll name some of these and I'll let you talk about some of them since you may be a little bit more of the expert. But another one that I might mention is intellectualization, and it's again these have similar themes. Intellectualization can be a way of experiencing life mainly through the intellect, through not going into the emotional content of something, but just going into the mental part of it and intellectualizing. So if there's a feeling happening, it's like thinking about the feeling or thinking about what's happening and being in the intellectual function as opposed to the emotional experience, which feels threatening. And then one last one that I'll mention because I think it's an important one is compartmentalization. But again, another way of saying something similar. Sometimes fives can put different aspects of their experience into different compartments or file folders as a way of separating things and making their experience less threatening. So sometimes this might mean putting different people in different boxes in your world so that if in case there's some threatening thing about them coming together, this can be putting different experiences into different categories so that they don't kind of bleed together in a way that somehow feels emotionally threatening. But I've named a few things. So what would you say about type 5 and their defenses?
Well, where do I start? How many hours do I have? When we hear the word isolation, we may get it wrong, thinking that it's physical isolation. But physical isolation is just one way of uh, allowing isolation to operate. Fives have this amazing capacity to build a bubble between them and the rest of the world. So they can very well feel alone when in public or even in a crowd, and disconnecting all the time, like not paying attention to something that the person is saying, and having that technique of knowing when the person is about to stop talking and then listening to the last six words just to be in the same subject. That happens because of isolation. But the main isolation is when we feel hurt, and then we disconnect. And boy, fives feel hurt all the time. So sometimes I look at you, B, as a two in our relationship, our friendship, our work relationship, in all areas of life. I look at you and say, wow, B gets hurts a lot. And then I look inside and say, well, I think that I get hurt as much. And the difference is that you stay in touch with your hurt, but I don't. I need a lot of effort to stay in touch with it because I isolate myself from that feeling of hurt. And what happens then is that I disconnect from that person, from the relationship. I disconnect from my heart, my emotions. and I disconnect from life. It's like I cannot keep sensing life around me. Otherwise, I'll connect back to that hurt and to all the experiences. And, isolation is not only about hurt and the other things I said, is isolating myself from the very experience of life, retreating inside. And it's not only inside the body, it's more than that. It's like fives end up um, having that tiny, very narrow tube of breath in the inside where they breathe the least possible when they are in personality. And saving movements, physical movements, like when I need to open a door and go through to another room, I I have a tendency not to open the door completely and to sneak in, as if, there's nothing that would make me sneak in other than the avarice, which is the passion. But also that happens by means of isolating myself from my body. So fives who want to grow need to really look at all those ways they isolate and the ways that they disconnect.
I want to say just a couple more things to finish out the type 5 defense mechanisms by way of clarification. Um, whereas isolation involves separating cognition and emotion, or thinking versus feeling emotions, compartmentalization is separating incompatible sets of ideas or thoughts. So, for instance, compartmentalization might mean holding two contradictory thoughts without seeing the contradiction. So, kind of putting things in different boxes to kind of not have to deal with maybe the messy conflict between different ideas or thoughts or beliefs. And one more thing I want to say about withdrawal is we often say that sometimes fives experienced some sort of intrusion or impingement early in life, either that or neglect. And again, this is a general thing. Different fives can have different stories. But experience of emotional intrusion or impingement, even by early caregivers, can reinforce a kind of withdrawal. In other words, a need to withdraw inside myself as a way of protecting myself from intrusion. And it's interesting because I referred to Nancy McWilliams, and she says she connects defense mechanisms with personality types, which is exactly what we're doing. And she notes that when a person withdraws habitually, and to the exclusion of other ways of responding to anxiety. So when withdrawal is inside oneself, is a way of coping. Analysts describe him or her as schizoid, right? So with this, she's even naming here, and I like to point this out because schizoid would be the sort of technical term for personality disorder, again, the unhealthy version in psychological mainstream psychology terms of what we would understand as a five. So don't go around calling your five friend schizoid. We all have one of these, by the way, except threes, because threes are seen as normal from the American psychiatric point of view. But it's interesting that these defense mechanisms are definitional of the personality type. They're so basic to the way we cope with anxiety and the way we survive in the world.
Yeah, although might not be that big of a problem to call a five an schizoid, because then they will isolate and disconnect and not feel the hurt of that, and will start
Right.
intellectualizing about being schizoid.
Right. So if that feels painful to be called schizoid, then you know you're on the right track, and that's actually a positive. All right. So let's talk about type 6. So the two main defense mechanisms of type 6 are projection and splitting. So projection is, I alluded to this before when I talked about the introduction of type 4. Projection is a kind of lack of a boundary, a perceived boundary between the inside of me and the outside of me. And it's when I see something that originates inside myself, like an emotion or an experience, as originating outside me. So sixes potentially can feel fear or something inside themselves. And if that feels threatening, they can look for the source of that fear outside themselves. So it's not that I'm feeling fearful, it's that you are threatening me, or you don't like me, or you are going to attack me. So it's seeing the origin of their internal experience as coming from the outside.
Yeah, so a simple way to explain projection. Imagine that you have a projector, like for movies or PowerPoint presentations, you have a projector like that above your head, and then that projector is turned on all the time and projecting things on the screen of your vision field. And that projector has a particular tendency to project more terror movies than other kinds of movies, right? So that is how the inner content of the projector works. It has more fear. Of course, that's the heart of a six, fear. Then it gets connected to that projected projector, and fear gets projected in the vision field for sixes up there, outside there. So projection is pushing the fear outside, and it's also in Latin it's the I outside, project. So it means that I'm pushing everything outside, fear mostly, but I also push outside my qualities, and I end up thinking that I'm not capable of doing something, that other people are better, and not owning my own qualities. I project them onto other people, project my authority onto other people. I also make them be either good or bad. And perhaps you can explain a bit more the splitting part when talking about sixes. But projection is sending everything outside, and sixes project their strength. They think that they are weaker. While
So a couple more points to make about projection. First of all is, it does have a benign or an adaptive or a way that it can be or happen, that's not destructive, it's not problematic, and that is when it's the basis of empathy. I imagine that the feeling that I'm having inside, it's the basis of empathy when I can feel your feelings inside myself and imagine what you might be feeling. However, when it's maladaptive, when it's coming from a place, an unconscious defensive mode, it breeds dangerous misunderstandings between people. And again, we all project, and sometimes when we're in intimate relationships, we start off, kind of really sort of seeing the positive in the person, and then over time we start to project onto them. We start to imagine, they are, what we think they are or what we fear they are. And we can sometimes not see the real person, and we can misperceive people because we're projecting onto them aspects of what we may feel anxious about or fearful of, or aspects of ourselves that we see as being part of them. Now, splitting is an important one to know for sixes too. Splitting originates at an early stage of psychological development in childhood, where young children can't hold good and bad together as being present in the same person. It's called ambivalence. Ambivalence implies having a double experience. So thinking like, when we're mature, we can realize, okay, my friend is a good person, but I don't like what my friend is doing right now. I don't like how they're behaving. And so I'm angry or I'm disliking my friend, but at the same time, I like my friend. That's ambivalence, when we can have these two good and bad feelings about the same person at the same time. Early on, we can't do that. It's like good and bad can't exist together. We don't have the psychological development to hold those two experiences together. So we split, and that is one outside, someone outside us needs to be good or bad, and then we hold the other side of that. So in other words, we see this a lot of times in political division, right? Where the opposite side, the other team, or in wars between countries or religious sects, the other side is all bad and we're all good. But in childhood, sometimes what happens is, because the child needs to see the parent as good or all good, to feel safe in the world, that my parent means me well and wants to take care of me, loves me. We can see our parent as good and ourselves as bad, and this is why sixes sometimes have this inner sense of badness, self-doubt, this sense of there's something wrong with me. And it's not exactly the same as shame as we might think of it as for other types. It's almost like this sense of there's something bad about me, which sometimes is associated with needing authority figures to be good. So we don't have to be too fearful about others with power outside us doing us damage. So there's a way that good and bad get split. And sometimes we can see others as all good or others as all bad, and not hold these two experiences together in one person. So let's move on to type 7, our last type. There are a few defense mechanisms associated with type 7. And the first one is, I would say, rationalization. So, rationalization is a defense mechanism by which we find good reasons to justify whatever it is we want to do. So instead of sort of seeing the good parts and the bad parts, or the positive intentions and the maybe not so sincere intentions associated with something we want to do, we see whatever we want to do as all good, all positive. We have many, many reasons why it's a good thing to do. Now, sevens do this because they want to justify doing what they want to do so they can be free of limits from the outside. They don't want to be constrained by other people telling them what to do or telling them they can't do something. And so this is one of the defense mechanisms. They can rationalize whatever it is that they want to see as good or positive, or something that they want to be able to do.
Right. So if you're a 7 and you've just listened to B's explanation, you might be thinking right now, I understand the other defense mechanisms. I also understand this one, but what's the problem with this one? Isn't it better to live life like this? And that, my dear, is rationalization. Sevens rationalize even rationalization itself. So they find an excuse, an explanation, like when they go to therapy or do some deep coaching with someone. They almost play tricks with that practitioner in ways that they fool them, so that they don't get caught in their issues. That's a tendency before they start really committing to doing more inner work. But this is all fueled by this tendency of the head called rationalization. By the way, for us to discuss, it seems to me that the defense mechanisms operate a bit more in the dominant center of intelligence of each type. So the defense mechanisms for eights, nines, and ones are a bit more around the belly. The defense mechanisms for twos, threes, and fours are a bit more around the heart. And the defense mechanisms for fives are a little bit more around the head, although it's not only that. But rationalization is definitely more around the head, right? It's a defense that uses the head to disconnect you from the heart and from the belly. So it's not only that defense mechanisms help you not be in touch or not threaten the passion and the fixation. It's also that the defense mechanism makes you keep having one of those three intelligences as the dominant one. And defense mechanisms don't like your project of developing the other two intelligences. That's what I mean. But rationalization is a great way for sevens to also see only the positives, to also see only possibilities and the bright side of things. It's just looking to the other side, or just pushing difficult content to the back of the mind, or to explain sad things that happen. Or, for instance, when someone really close to you that you love dies, you'll be the one taking care of the funeral, right? So you do all the paperwork and so on when that happens, so that you don't suffer. But guess what? People who go through grief before heal from it before you.
Two other defense mechanisms associated with type 7 that are important to know are idealization and devaluation. And of course, devaluation is the downside of idealization, or the other side. Idealization is when we have a need to see something or someone as very positive. This is seen in children when they see their parents as all powerful or as all good. Sevens do this, where they see different people or experiences as amazing, and all they see are the good aspects. But of course, this can kind of set up a kind of devaluation, because when we see someone as all good, or we put people on a pedestal, we see someone as superhuman, inevitably, when we find out they're actually human, there can be a kind of devaluation, or kind of going to the other side. Or for sevens, they can devalue certain experiences as a way of saying, "Oh, I don't want to do that. That's a bad thing." And again, this can be a way of seeing things as overly positive or overly negative. Things that they want to engage in as all positive, and things that or people they don't want to engage with as all negative. It's time for our top 5.
What is our top 5 today, B?
Our top 5 is the top 5 biggest procrastinators.
Ooh, let's see. It won't be good to be number one then. Let's see.
For some reason, I think this is a good one. I think a lot
Yeah,
of people are procrastinators, but I do think that there is a hierarchy of
yeah,
biggest to
me too.
lesser procrastinators.
Let's see to what extent we will agree with each other.
Okay. Okay.
What
So
is
what
your
do
number 5?
Okay, my number 5 is ones. And this is because I do think ones procrastinate often because they're trying to make it more and more perfect, and it never feels good enough. And so they can take more time past the deadline and have trouble really getting to the finish line. But I do think that ones are also, very routine oriented and process oriented, and they want to do things right, and so they also put pressure on themselves to get it in. So they may not be the people who are procrastinating forever. What's your top 5? What's your number 5?
My number 5 is ones. Just like you.
Ah,
Yeah, the same reasoning. I agree with what you said, and I think ones are not the biggest procrastinators because they're also very responsible. After all, they are also body types, very, you know, practical, also objective. So, yeah, what makes them procrastinate a bit, though, is the perfectionistic streak. But yeah, and what is your number 4?
my number 4 is twos, and I put myself here because I must confess I am a big procrastinator. I often in my life, especially when I was in school, like in college and studying, I often did things at the very last minute, and I stayed up all night writing papers on many occasions. And I do think it's always important in terms of talking about type differences to understand why is the person procrastinating. It's not just that being a procrastinator tells you what type someone is, because of course, as we're saying, people do it for different reasons. And for me, and this is a little bit seven-ish, but for me, I always didn't want to do the difficult, hard thing, and I wanted to have fun, and I wanted to have pleasure, and I wanted to indulge myself, and so it was really hard for me to make myself do hard things. And maybe this is a little bit more self-preservation too than the other twos. I guess I would have to take a survey of my two friends, but I put twos in there because I think sometimes I think another thing that happens for twos is we get so busy, we overbook ourselves, we have too much on our plate, we take on too much, and that's another reason why we can be a little bit late with things or doing things kind of right at the end.
Hmm. Wow, that's
What
all
was
very interesting because I don't uh, especially see you as being the procrastinator, and I guess it's because I'm even more so, and then you compensate, you know. So let's see. But but my number four is sevens. I think that sevens are yet not the biggest procrastinators, but when it comes to things that are not pleasant, when they don't see things as being positive, or when they need to have a stance of going against someone, doing something that will not be nice or popular or whatever is not positive in their minds, they can procrastinate them. Actually, they have two different mechanisms. One, used by some sevens more than others, is to procrastinate, and the other one is let me do it very quickly so that it goes away quickly, and then I'll do what I like. So it's either or both, but sevens are my number four.
what's funny is I originally had sevens at number 4 and I had twos at number 3 and I switched them around. So I have sevens at my number 3, and for pretty much all the same reasons you did. I think they often are distractible, and so they can think of more things to do or more things to think about, or more things to add to the list of what needs to be done in order to do something as well. So I think it's also, and of course, wanting to have fun and not wanting to do the tedious boring thing. But I also agree with you. I've heard a lot of sevens say, especially very functional sevens who have had a lot of success in actually accomplishing a lot, that what they do is they do the hard thing first to get it out of the way so they can get to the fun part, exactly as you said. So yes, but sevens are my number 3. What's your number 3?
Fives. I think that fives can procrastinate quite a bit. I definitely procrastinate quite a bit. We procrastinate when people are requesting or demanding things of us, and we were not particularly wishing to do them. Also,
Wait, can I say something here? Can I
yeah,
say
yeah,
I think that's called passive aggression?
yeah, but that passive aggressiveness leads to procrastination of some things, and
Okay.
it's like, um,
I'm glad
you
I'm
know,
glad you own that.
oh yeah, yeah, and it's all fives, I guess. It's not only me because fives are known for having a backlog of work, like putting people in a line or queue, So it's fun because it's all about not, not making yourself too open to requests from others or especially demands. And also with our own ideas, we overthink them, and that leads to procrastination. I do think we do that even more than sevens or ones. What is your second?
So my second is, and here I did my little cheat, but only once this time. I have a tie between sixes and fives. And fives for much of the reasons you said. While you were talking, it reminded me of when I was in graduate school. I cut out of the newspaper this, back when we were using more newspapers, this Matt Groening cartoon. And, he was the guy who invented the Simpsons cartoon. He had a really funny cartoon about like why people don't finish their dissertation. And one of the big ones was, I have to read another book. And so I thought of that. It's like fives may not ever feel like they have enough information, and they're really interested in learning more. And so it's like learning more and more and more can be another way of not getting things done. But I
Yeah,
think sixes, I want to emphasize sixes, since I think you also said a lot of the rationale for fives. Sixes, I think, are, the second biggest procrastinators because um, for many reasons, I think. One, they can get stuck in doubt and questioning. They can doubt themselves a lot. They can fear success. And sometimes accomplishing something, finishing something means being successful, and success can make them a target. And so they can avoid that. And I also think a little bit like fives, it can feel like I haven't done enough analysis. I haven't gotten all the information I need. I can't be certain enough to move forward on something. And so sixes can often be really big procrastinators.
I agree, and this is why sixes are my number two. I do think that sixes procrastinate more than fives, actually, and it's all about feeling insecure, not owning their own authority. The fixation of sixes on the Enneagram is called cowardice, and fixation is a fixed mental pattern or belief, a limiting belief. And cowardice is doubt, is trying, needing to do it again to see if it's right, rehearse one more time, talk to a second or a third person, plan it one more time. So all that leads to procrastination. And it has to do with not trusting that things will go well, and also not trusting others and self. So it's all a recipe for procrastination. So I do think sixes procrastinate quite a lot.
I think our lists are more similar this time than they often are. And I think we probably have the same type at
Yeah,
the number one position.
I think so. But I also see that I very nicely left out the type two, but you didn't leave me out of this list.
I think that's because, from your point of view, compared to you, I don't procrastinate as much.
Yeah.
uh,
So what is your first? Probably mine too.
I'm usually the one saying to you, "Hey, where is that thing? Have you done that yet?"
Hey, this is
and,
a
and
podcast.
and
It's
not
not
the
for
other
you
way
to
around.
just disclose our issues here.
I thought this was an open conversation. I thought that was the appeal of our
Oh
podcast.
my, yeah. I'll remember that in the future. Yeah.
Uh-oh. Okay. So at the number one position is type 9. And I think that nines are procrastinators, again, for a slightly different reason than the reasons we've given for other types, and probably a few reasons. But one, I think, at the top of the list is that a big habit for nines, part of their coping strategy is they focus so much on what's outside themselves, and they get more motivated to do things for others. And it can be hard for them to access their own priorities, for them to take action on behalf of their own agenda. And so sometimes they may just not tune into what they need to do, and not act on what's most important. They do less important things, because it can be hard to marshal their energy in support of themselves. And now, of course, a little bit like we pointed out with fives, I think there can also be an element of passive aggression that can get involved in some incidents of procrastination for nines. But what would you add to that? Why did you put nines in your
Yeah,
top
I did
top
put nines
spot?
on my top spot, and I like all you said. I really agree. And what I would add is the multiple reasons that lead nine to procrastinate. So when it's about them doing something for themselves, they don't have the energy and they push it to the future, maybe sometime later, because it's about self-forgetting, nines. Also, when they are angry at other people, they will procrastinate what other people want them to do in a passive aggressive movement. But it's not only when they are angry. And by the way, they don't show anger directly, they are indirect in doing that. But it's not only when they are angry, it's also when they feel pressed in any way, shape, or form. So it's very easy for nines to feel pressed, and then they procrastinate. Whatever you want them to do quickly, they will do more slowly. And also, they procrastinate in the start of any new project that they are taking the lead of. It's not easy for nines to start things that are new or new cycles, while it's very easy for them to keep doing things that are already happening, like operational stuff. So a lot of reasons to procrastinate, and in practice they procrastinate a lot. In my view, more than sixes.
And I think that's a good place to stop. So thank you again for listening to our Enneagram 2.0 podcast. Join us again next time where we talk about all things Enneagram.